Not all believers are safe. Some hide control behind Scripture. Faith is supposed to bring freedom, compassion, and genuine connection. But in the hands of certain people, it becomes a weapon, a tool for manipulation, a shield for behavior that would be recognized as harmful anywhere else, except it's wrapped in religious language, so you question whether you're allowed to call it out. I'm going to show you 6 psychological patterns that separate authentic faith from dangerous religiosity. These aren't theological debates. They're behavioral red flags that appear regardless of denomination, regardless of how much someone quotes Scripture, regardless of how spiritual they appear. If you recognize even one of these patterns in someone close to you, pay attention. Here's the problem. Dangerous religious behavior hides behind the appearance of devotion. The more Scripture someone quotes, the more spiritual language they use, the harder it becomes to identify manipulation. You start questioning your own judgment. Maybe you're being too sensitive. Maybe you're not spiritual enough to understand. Maybe questioning them means you're questioning God. That confusion is intentional. Dangerous Christians weaponize your respect for faith against you. They understand that most people won't challenge behavior if it's presented as religious conviction, and they exploit that hesitation ruthlessly. Sign 1. They use God to avoid accountability. Divine authority replaces personal responsibility. Watch how they respond when confronted about harmful behavior. Instead of acknowledging impact, instead of apologizing or changing, they redirect to God. I was following God's will. The Lord told me to do this. You're questioning God, not me. Every criticism becomes an attack on their faith, rather than a legitimate concern about their actions. This creates an impossible dynamic. You can't address their behavior without being framed as spiritually deficient. They've positioned themselves as God's mouthpiece, which means disagreeing with them equals disagreeing with divine will. It's a psychological trap that shuts down all accountability. The damage shows up gradually. People around them stop voicing concerns. Stop pointing out inconsistencies. Stop expecting basic human decency because everything gets filtered through God's plan. And without accountability, behavior escalates. What starts as small manipulations becomes systematic control, all justified as spiritual leadership. But avoiding accountability is just the foundation. The control goes deeper. Sign 2, they isolate you from outside perspectives. Your circle shrinks to people they approve. Dangerous Christians systematically separate you from anyone who might challenge their influence. Friends who aren't spiritual enough become bad influences. Family members who ask questions become threats to your faith. Any relationship that existed before them becomes suspect. They don't do this overtly. They do it through concern. I'm worried about how much time you spend with them. They don't understand your calling. I can see their influence pulling you away from God. True believers wouldn't question what we're building here. It sounds like spiritual protection. It's actually social control. The result is predictable. Your world shrinks to people who reinforce their narrative. No outside perspectives. No alternative interpretations. No one to point out that what's happening isn't normal. You become dependent on their version of reality because it's the only version you're allowed to hear. And once you're isolated, they can rewrite truth without resistance. Your memory becomes unreliable. Your judgment becomes questionable. Their interpretation becomes absolute. Because there's no one left to confirm what you're experiencing is actually wrong. Isolation creates dependency, but dependency requires constant reinforcement. Sign 3. They create fear of consequences. Obedience is motivated by terror, not love. Listen to how they talk about God. Is it primarily about love, grace, and freedom? Or is it about punishment, judgment, and eternal consequences? Dangerous Christians weaponize fear. They use the threat of divine retribution to control behavior, enforce compliance, and prevent questions. Every boundary you try to set becomes a spiritual risk. If you walk away from this, you're walking away from God. Questioning me is inviting darkness into your life. You'll lose your salvation if you don't submit. The stakes are deliberately raised to cosmic levels so that even small acts of independence feel like spiritual rebellion. This creates a psychological prison. You stay not because you want to, but because you're terrified of what will happen if you leave. And that fear is carefully cultivated. They remind you constantly of people who left and suffered consequences. They interpret every negative event in your life as evidence that you're not obedient enough. They make God feel dangerous rather than loving. The emotional damage is profound. You live in constant anxiety, constantly monitoring your thoughts and behavior for signs of spiritual failure. Peace becomes impossible because you're always one misstep away from divine punishment. And they're the ones defining what counts as a misstep. Fear keeps you compliant, but compliance alone isn't enough for them. Sign 4, they demand unquestioning obedience. Questions are treated as spiritual deficiency. Healthy faith invites questions, encourages wrestling with difficult concepts, respects doubt as part of genuine spiritual growth. Dangerous Christianity demands absolute certainty and punishes intellectual curiosity. If you question their interpretation, their authority, or their methods, you're labeled as weak in faith, rebellious, or influenced by evil. They create a culture where asking why is dangerous, where expressing doubt is shameful, where thinking independently is spiritual pride. You're taught to suppress your own discernment and replace it with their certainty. And if you can't do that convincingly enough, you're performing faith to avoid being targeted as spiritually compromised. The psychological mechanism is simple. They equate their personal authority with God's authority. Obeying them becomes synonymous with obeying God. Questioning them becomes synonymous with rebellion against the divine. This isn't faith, it's authoritarianism dressed in religious language. Over time, you lose the ability to trust your own judgment. You second-guess every instinct, every concern, every moment of discomfort, because you've been trained that your internal compass is corrupted and only their guidance is pure. That's not spiritual leadership, that's psychological colonization. Obedience gives them control, but to maintain it, they need you disconnected from yourself. Sign 5, they exploit guilt and shame. You're never righteous enough. Watch the emotional atmosphere they create. Is it one of grace, acceptance, and growth? Or is it constant guilt, perpetual inadequacy, and shame-based motivation? Dangerous Christians keep you in a state of spiritual insecurity. You're always falling short, always needing more correction, always one mistake away from losing favor with God. This isn't accidental. Guilt and shame are control mechanisms. When you feel perpetually unworthy, you become desperate for approval, and they position themselves as the gatekeepers of that approval. They can grant or withhold spiritual validation based on your compliance with their demands. The cycle is vicious. You try harder, sacrifice more, give up more of yourself, hoping to finally feel acceptable. But the bar keeps moving. There's always another level of devotion required, another sacrifice demanded, another part of yourself that needs to be surrendered. Because if you ever felt fully accepted, you might stop being controllable. This creates profound psychological damage. Your self-worth becomes entirely external, dependent on their assessment of your spiritual state. You lose connection with your own value, your own worth, your own inherent dignity, and you become willing to accept almost anything to escape the crushing weight of constant shame. Shame keeps you small. And there's one final pattern that reveals their true nature. Sign 6, they show different faces to different people. The public persona doesn't match the private reality. This is the pattern that makes you question your sanity. In public, in church, around people they need to impress, they're kind, humble, inspiring. They quote scripture beautifully. They speak about love and grace. They appear to be everything a faithful person should be. But in private, behind closed doors, with people who are already under their control, the mask drops. They're cold, demanding, manipulative. They use entirely different language. The grace they preached publicly becomes conditional. The love they proclaimed becomes transactional. The humility they displayed becomes arrogance. This duality serves a purpose. The public face provides plausible deniability. When you try to tell others what you're experiencing privately, they don't believe you. That's not the person I know. They've always been so loving to me. Maybe you're misinterpreting their intentions. Your reality gets invalidated because their performance is that convincing. You start doubting yourself. Maybe you are the problem. Maybe you're seeing things that aren't there. Maybe you're being ungrateful or rebellious because everyone else sees a saint and only you see the manipulation. That cognitive dissonance is intentional. It keeps you trapped, isolated, unable to seek help because you can't prove what you're experiencing. But here's the truth. Integrated people don't have radically different personalities in different contexts. Authentic faith doesn't require performance. If someone is loving in public but controlling in private, the private version is the real one. The public version is strategy. True faith liberates. False religion imprisons. Know the difference.